the question is about macros while bulking, and specifically with carbohydrate overfeeding. Now, we have covered protein overfeeding previously on the podcast, and we've addressed there's a bit of an argument going related to protein overfeeding about how likely or even possible it is for one to gain fat with high protein overfeeding. And in that segment, we kind of went through it and said, well, thermodynamics still work. We can go and calculate exactly where the energy is going. There are no free calories in this situation, but there are major impacts on the thermic effect of feeding, major impacts on satiety. And the more controlled you get with those protein overfeeding studies, the less ambiguity is. The more tightly controlled those studies are, the more you can identify exactly where the consumed calories went. Now, with carbohydrate overfeeding, there are two kind of common claims that get tossed around. One is the fact that directly converting excess carbohydrate to fat, so that's called de novo lipogenesis, taking extra carbohydrate, converting it directly to fat for storage. A common claim you hear is that is very inefficient and that it rarely occurs or almost never occurs. And so people hear those two things without any context or nuance connected to them, and they start to get this idea like, okay, well, if I'm not going to, turn this into fat and store it, perhaps there's a little bit of a cheat code when it comes to bulking, which is just, as long as you're going over with carbs, whatever, you're not going to store it as fat. You'll burn it all off. No big deal. So, eat the carbs to your heart's content. And what's really important is that the term inefficient, I think, needs to be operationally defined to provide a better understanding of what that means. And even the term rarely occurs, I think it's very important and helpful to contextualize that with a little bit of nuance. So I've seen the studies that a lot of people use when they say, hey, de novo lipogenesis is super rare, so rare that it's basically not even worth considering in any context. Yeah. And when you look at those studies, you will find that they are doing very aggressive, very high carb overfeeding, but they are not doing radical fat restriction. And so usually what happens there is it's certainly a high intake of carbohydrate, but there's still plenty of fat being consumed there. So de novo lipogenesis rarely occurs in that context because that's not the path of least resistance. Your body is not going to see all this influx of carbohydrate and fat. It is not going to oxidize that fat and then take the carbohydrate and convert it to fat for storage. That simply doesn't make sense energetically. And what you find is your body, when there's this huge influx of extra calories and it's carbohydrate and fat, what your body likes to do is it'll allocate some of that carbohydrate to glycogen, for sure. A lot of that fat is going to go straight to storage. And instead of burning fat at rest, which is kind of our typical default state in a fasted situation, your body's going to say, well, there's all this carbohydrate. Storing it as fat is going to be a pain in the ass. Let's just oxidize that instead of the fat. So like I said, normal fasting situation, you're burning mostly fat at rest. When you have this huge influx of carbohydrate, your body just says, well, I'll burn the carbohydrate for energy now. Some of the carbohydrate's going to go to glycogen. The fat, I'm going to store that. And that's pretty much what happens. And if the overfeeding is large enough and the excess energy intake is high enough and it's super high carbohydrate, one of the things that you'll notice is that carbohydrate tends to have a higher thermic effect of feeding than fat. And so when you're trying to figure out with this huge influx of carbohydrate, if it's not getting converted to fat and stored, where is it going? You can start to piece together exactly where it's going. You can see that it's being used mostly it's just being oxidized to meet energy needs at that time. Mm-hmm. Some of it's going to glycogen. And, because there is a pretty substantial it's not as high as protein, but carbohydrate does have a noteworthy thermic effect. There are some extra calories that are just getting burned due to the thermic effect of feeding. And so there are some studies looking at a very different scenario, which is basically what happens with super high carb overfeeding with very extreme fat restriction. And when you look at that research, things look a little bit different. Of course, there's still the high thermic effect, or moderate, I would say, thermic effect of carbohydrate ingestion. There's no fat coming in within these extreme experimental scenarios. So it's not going to be, kind of storing the fat, oxidizing the carbs. What's going to happen is with this really high carb, extremely, extremely, extremely low fat overfeeding, of course, the body's going to have that thermic effect of the meal. The body is going to oxidize carbohydrate to meet immediate energy needs. Much of that carbohydrate is going to go to saturate glycogen stores, and in some cases even super compensate and kind of really, really pack in as much glycogen as possible. But after that, there will be some de novo lipogenesis that occurs. That absolutely has been observed in the research. And so the question about, is it possible? What are the situations where it might be observed? It really comes down to how extreme is the overfeeding and how extreme is the degree of fat restriction. So we have everything we need in our body to do de novo lipogenesis with carbohydrate. It's rarely the path of least resistance. It's rarely the path that makes sense because there's usually fat coming into the diet and we're just like, whatever, store the fat, burn the carbs. But I think because people often talk about this concept without some of the nuance and some of the details of the studies, some people have kind of gotten the impression, well, just go crazy with the carbs. Worst case scenario, you burn it all off, but you certainly won't store it as fat. That's not necessarily strictly the case, but practically speaking, you think of, I'm just trying to put this into real world terms here. Let's say you're doing a diet, overfeeding, you're bulking hard. It's 1,000 carbs a day, 40 grams of fat a day, 180 protein. That is a pretty extreme macro breakdown. I mean, that is only a 7% fat diet, which I personally wouldn't recommend. But, it's going to be hard to get 1,000 grams of carbs and 180 grams of protein without at least 40 grams of fat finding their way in there. You'd have to go really far out of your way to make that work. So even in that context, you're still getting that 40 grams of fat coming in that could be stored. And so if you're storing 40 grams of fat a day, and you're doing that as your kind of daily diet, even with that alone, without any need for de novo lipogenesis, you're talking about over 32 pounds of fat stored per year. So what happens is we kind of look at these isolated findings that are in different situations with different degrees of overfeeding, different degrees of fat restriction. We start making conclusions about whether or not de novo lipogenesis is likely to occur, whether or not it's observed commonly. And then that kind of snowballs into this kind of series of working conclusions about what happens with high carb overfeeding. So I just wanted to kind of explain in a little more detail what the situation is with high carb overfeeding, because it's definitely not a cheat code. There's no free calories happening here with high carb overfeeding. But what you will find is, like I said, there's a major shift in substrate oxidation. That's for sure. In most diets, even with some pretty low fat diets, like I said, the example I gave was 7% fat, you might not even need to do much de novo lipogenesis at all there because there is fat that's going to be stored there. So I wanted to clarify where some of these carbs are going. And if you need to, you absolutely can do de novo lipogenesis and convert carbohydrate to fat. That is a relatively costly way to store carbohydrate. So you will use ATP in the process. And so you will see that the energy waste that occurs there is elevated. And so what that means is when you look at studies that compare head to head, high carb overfeeding versus high fat overfeeding, if the calorie content of the two overfeeding diets is equivalent, you will store more fat on the high fat overfeeding. And the reason is, generally speaking, you're going to see a lower thermic effect of feeding and metabolic pathways for fat storage that are less costly in that scenario. So people will look at these two at interventions and say, wow, the high carb overfeeding led to less fat gain. than the high fat overfeeding, even though calories controlled. What's going on with the missing carbs or the missing calories from carbs? It's just slightly more costly or slightly less efficient metabolic pathways that is leading to some wastage, just some burning of energy that is then, because it's being burnt, not available for storage.